Welcome to another video, everybody, and today I'm going to be talking about how to photograph birds on the water. Photographing birds on the water is definitely one of my favourite things in bird photography, but there are a few things that you need to pay attention to. So in this video I'm going to go through a few suggestions and a few tips for how to approach those images in terms of viewpoint, in terms of exposure, and a couple of other things as well. The first thing is I always like to select the tracking autofocus, the continuous autofocus, that's servo if you're using Canon. And the reason for that is that birds on the water, they're likely to be moving the whole time. So obviously if the bird's swimming, it is going to be moving, you want to track it. But even when the bird looks like it's staying completely still, because it's on the water, the likelihood is it is still moving a bit, drifting around. So it's unlikely to be completely still. For that reason, you're better to select continuous tracking autofocus mode on your camera. How low you get to the water is a really big consideration. So I would say don't take your pictures from head height, try and get lower down to the water if you can. Now for me personally, I absolutely love those shots where I get really close, maybe lying down, really close to the water level, get eye level with the bird. I love the effects that you get from that. So if you can do that, you're going to get really engaging photos. I think they work the best because you are at eye level with the bird. It makes it more engaging. It makes the viewer feel like you're really there, you know, with the water in those surroundings. So if you haven't done that, give it a try. It can be very difficult. You want to look for those areas of water where you can get very close to the water's edge and you're able to lie down without too much difficulty. It can be difficult to find those locations. If you can't do that, then just try and get as low as you can. So for me, it's like my default setting, if you like, is to get as close to the water as I can because I just love to do that. But there is one problem with that which can occur sometimes, and that is that you can sometimes get a line in the picture. This is quite a good example. So I've got a line running here on the opposite side. So what happens depends on the background, where you're shooting, how far away you are, but sometimes you can end up with this line basically where the bank or the reeds meet the water, like that break line, and you can get that in your shot in the background. And sometimes that can kind of run through the bird, it can cut through it, or almost like cut through its neck, and it doesn't look very appealing. So be aware of that. If you use a big lens, it will help because it will soften the background enough that that line might not be very apparent, but if it's a smaller lens, then that might be more of a problem. So sometimes it can actually be better just to shoot from a little bit higher, and then it takes that line out completely, and what you end up with is a pure water background. Just shoot a little bit higher and you get pure water foreground and background, really nice and clean, and could be some nice colour in there as well. What is the best type of camera support for this type of photography? Well, if you've got something fairly light, you might just be able to hand hold, you might be able to do that for a while. Personally, I much prefer to have something to support the camera, and that's largely because it just supports the weight. I don't have to worry about holding that weight for long periods of time. So myself, if I was going for the slightly higher viewpoint, which I talked about earlier, then I'd use a tripod with gimbal head or the fluid head, and I'd shoot from there. Also, if you've got one of those tripods that goes flat, where you can flatten the legs out, you can get it directly on the ground, and in that way you can get those low-level images that I absolutely love. I'm a bit addicted to. I think I'm a water baby as well. Anyway, that's kind of by the point. So not all tripods will do that, it depends what kind you've got. The other option, really simple, is to use a beanbag. So you can use a beanbag. Again, that's getting the camera almost directly on the ground. That's kind of easier for carrying around sometimes, can be. The only problem with the beanbag is it's harder to pan, because if you try and pan the camera, sometimes when you've got a manual focus ring, which is here, if you try and pan on a beanbag, sometimes it can kind of grip the focus ring, it could actually move the focus. So I have had that happen to me in the past. It will depend on the lens, where the focus ring is, all that kind of thing, but do be aware of that problem happening. So I definitely recommend something where you can pan, which brings me to the next thing, which is my pan, which I haven't got really a name for. I just called it Pantastic. I've got to come up with something better than that. Feel free to send in suggestions, and it's just a frying pan really with a screw in the middle, screw fit for your sort of standard tripod head. It's the larger screw fit for a tripod head, and I put a ball head on this. This is important, I don't use a gimbal. It doesn't work as well with the gimbal. It works really well with the ball head. So it's a good strong solid ball head, and then I tighten up the different knobs to get the right amount of movement, but not too loose. Do you need to conceal yourself for this type of photography? Well, it really depends where you're shooting. So if you're shooting in a local park, the ducks are used to people, then you can probably just get low down and photograph the ducks and it'd be absolutely fine. There might be some species that are a little bit more nervous, in which case if you get lower down, that's going to help. Also, if you put a hood up, maybe, just if you've got a big hood, you could just cover your face, cover your head, that might help as well. With the warier birds, the fact that you're lying down, that'll make a really big difference, because it's just that lower profile makes you less obvious and it makes them less nervous of you. There will be situations where, you're out in the wild and the birds are much more wary of humans. In that case, it'd be much better to, wear dull clothes, maybe camouflage. Green gloves, for example, and then even the camouflage hood over your head as well. Even you might want to throw like a camouflage net over you. That would be the best option. Again, the lower you can get, the more concealed you're going to be and less of a threat you're going to be to the birds. It's really important that you pay attention to your exposure when you're shooting around water. So the nature of water, reflecting light in different ways, with shadows and reflections, it means that it can influence the exposure meter. So you do want to pay attention to it. What I find a lot of the time is that your images will underexpose. If you look behind me here, it's a perfect example. So if you have a large amount of that water in the shot, because it's bright, it's going to suggest that the camera needs less exposure and it's going to come out a bit too dark. So very common that you'll need to overexpose. So a lot of the time, if you have water in the shot, I would suggest adding maybe about plus 2/3 exposure compensation, depends on the light. Having said that, there are even occasions when it can be the opposite. You're kind of looking at the water towards a bank and it's reflecting it. It might actually be really dark. Sometimes it can just look a bit murky. That could influence the exposure meter in the opposite direction. So what I tend to do is take a test shot. So I'll try and take a test shot of the general scene I'm looking at with the water in it, and I'll look at that on the back of the camera and assess it. If you've got time to do that, that is. You don't always have time. I'll also try and look at the histogram, and I'll make sure that the different peaks in the histogram are where I expect them to be, and the water, if it's light water, then that peak on the histogram should be towards the right hand side, maybe 2/3. Of course, one of the best things about water are the reflections, so always be on the lookout for reflections. That could be pure reflections of the bird, it could be a horizontal or vertical format. It can work in both directions. Also look out for reflections of the surroundings. It can be really lovely, and I actually think it can make better images sometimes to include reflections from the surrounding habitat, and particularly if you've got a calm day, you do need low winds, calm water. If you can get that, you can sometimes get almost mirror image reflections, and those are some of the images that I love more than anything. Sometimes you just won't be able to get reflection. If you're too close to the bird, you won't be able to get the reflection in the composition as well, and sometimes it's just too windy to really do much with it. But be on the lookout, particularly on those calm days. In the right conditions, you've also got the chance of mist over the water as well. So if you're thinking of heading out to photograph some birds on the water, then check the weather forecast, and particularly in spring and autumn, you've got more of a chance of getting that early morning mist still hanging around over the water, and then you can get some really magical images. And the interesting thing about the mist is it can look very different. You can get very different tones to your image. So depending on how much cloud, depending on the direction you're shooting, sometimes you can get images that have a very cold bluish cast to them, which I find quite interesting, maybe a little bit soothing. And then other times, especially where the sun's coming through, you can get more brighter colours, warmer colours, pinks and oranges. So it really depends on how much mist, how much sun, which direction you're shooting. If you want to learn more tips for photographing birds and wildlife, then check the various tutorials on my channel. Also, click the subscribe button if you haven't already, but please do click the bell icon for notifications. Thanks for watching everybody, and I'll see you somewhere in nature sometime soon.